Megan Harris was the heart of Ravenswood, beloved, trusted, and seemingly untouchable. But when she disappeared without a trace, it would take the darkest secrets of an old flame, Marcus Hartwell, to uncover a shocking truth that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a simple reconnection turned into a twisted game of betrayal, greed, and murder that would shatter the quiet town forever. It was an ordinary morning in Ravenswood, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside. The sun shone brightly through the trees as the streets began to come alive with the bustle of people heading to work, the soft hum of cars passing by, and the occasional bark of a dog. The town, with its charming cottages and old-fashioned main street, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where neighbors shared morning coffee, and where you could leave your front door unlocked without a second thought. It was the sort of community where crime was unheard of and safety was assumed. No one could have predicted that something horrific was about to shatter this sense of peace. Megan Harris, a 32-year-old high school teacher, was a well-known figure in Ravenswood. She had lived there all her life, her roots deep in the town's history. She was kind-hearted and well-liked, the type of person who could always be counted on to lend a hand or offer a comforting word. Her students adored her, and she had a natural ability to connect with them, whether it was helping them with their schoolwork or offering them a safe space when life got tough. She was also very close to her family, especially her mother, who lived just a few blocks away, and her friends admired her for her loyalty and compassion. On that fateful day, Megan had worked her usual shift at the local school, helping prepare for an upcoming exam. She had made plans to meet some friends for dinner at a cafe on Main Street later that evening, something they did once a week to catch up and relax. But when she didn't show up for dinner, her friends grew concerned. Megan was always punctual, and if something had come up, she would have at least sent a message. By the time her friends started calling and texting, Megan's phone was going straight to voicemail. They assumed maybe she was caught up in a meeting or had a late class to teach. But as the evening wore on, and there was still no word from her, the worry began to settle in. The next morning, when Megan hadn't shown up for work, the alarm bells rang. Her colleagues were baffled. She had never missed a day without notifying someone, and this sudden silence from Megan was completely out of character. Her friends and family, growing more anxious, began reaching out to the authorities. It was then that the search began in earnest. The police arrived at Megan's home, where everything appeared normal at first glance. Her front door was unlocked, something that was quite unusual but not unheard of in a town where residents trusted each other. Inside, there were no signs of a struggle, no obvious sign that anything was amiss. Her shoes were neatly placed by the door, and her coat hung in its usual spot. It seemed like she had just stepped out for a moment, planning to return soon. Her car, however, was parked outside. It was unlocked, and sitting inside was her phone, cracked from what seemed like a recent fall. But the phone wasn't the most disturbing detail. It was the absence of Megan. No one had seen her leave the house, and there was no indication of where she could have gone. The mystery was beginning to deepen. The police checked Megan's phone records and found that her last communication had been with a close friend the evening before, but nothing after that. Her car hadn't been seen driving anywhere, and no one had reported hearing anything unusual. It was as if she had simply vanished. The whole town was on edge. Everyone who knew Megan had a hard time believing she could just disappear without a trace. Yet no one could offer any explanation for her absence, and with each passing hour the mystery of Megan's disappearance deepened. What had happened to her, and where could she possibly be? The hunt for answers had only just begun. The search for Megan Harris grew more intense with each passing day, as the authorities and the small town of Ravenswood were gripped by a sense of unease. Megan's disappearance was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced in the town. No one could fathom who would want to harm her or why she might have disappeared. Despite the tight-knit nature of the community, it seemed that no one had any answers. The police organized a search party, which combed through the woods, fields, and abandoned buildings surrounding Ravenswood. Volunteers from the community joined in, their faces etched with worry. The town had always prided itself on being a safe place, but now the feeling of security that had once defined it seemed like a distant memory. There were whispers on the streets, rumors about what might have happened to Megan. Some speculated that she had simply run away, though that seemed impossible given her character. She had no reason to leave, especially without telling anyone. Others wondered if someone had taken her, but even then there was no clear suspect. Days turned into a week, and still there was no sign of Megan. The police had already interviewed her closest friends and family, but they hadn't been able to provide any solid leads. Megan's mother, Caroline, was beside herself. She couldn't understand how her daughter could just vanish without a trace. She insisted that Megan would never leave without telling her, but the truth was, no one knew where she had gone or why. Then, just as hope seemed to be slipping away, a breakthrough arrived. A local store owner who had a security camera pointed at the parking lot outside his business contacted the police. He had checked his footage and saw something that made his heart race. On the night Megan disappeared, her car had been parked in the lot around midnight. In the footage, Megan could be seen getting out of her car, looking around as if searching for someone. A few minutes later, a figure approached her from the shadows and walked toward her car. The image was grainy and unclear, but the shape of the person was unmistakable. It was a man, someone Megan seemed to know, though the image wasn't detailed enough to identify him. This new lead reignited the investigation. Police had long suspected that Megan's disappearance was not voluntary, but this footage confirmed their fears. Someone had been with her, and they might have had a hand in what happened. The authorities immediately launched a more focused search for the mysterious man, but the blurry image made it difficult to get a clear picture of who he was. No one recognized him, and it seemed that Megan had met him outside of her usual circles. The search for the man intensified. The police began to dig into Megan's recent activities, trying to identify anyone who could have had contact with her in the days leading up to her disappearance. They spoke to her co-workers, her friends, even her ex-husband, but there was no one who stood out as a suspect. It was as though Megan's life had been quiet and uneventful, with no indication that something dark and dangerous was lurking just beneath the surface. But with this new clue, the investigation began to take shape. The footage from the security camera gave the detectives hope, even though they had no idea how deep the mystery went or how far it would lead. There was one thing they were certain of: Megan's disappearance was no accident, and the person who was seen with her on that tape was about to become their primary suspect. A week passed without any significant progress in the case. The town of Ravenswood, once filled with quiet routines and friendly chatter, was now steeped in an air of dread. People glanced nervously over their shoulders, and every conversation seemed to circle back to one question: what had happened to Megan Harris? The footage from the security camera had been analyzed, but it provided little more than a grainy image of a man approaching Megan's car. Even though the police had circulated the image to the public, no one could come forward with any helpful information. The investigation had hit a dead end, and the absence of concrete leads was beginning to wear on the authorities. Then a breakthrough arrived from the most unlikely of sources: a group of volunteers who had been searching the woods near Ravenswood. While combing through a remote area, one of the volunteers, a local farmer named Gerald, stumbled across something that sent chills down his spine. Deep in a thicket of trees, he found an old abandoned cabin, half hidden by overgrown vines and bushes. It had clearly been uninhabited for years. At first he thought nothing of it, but something inside told him to take a closer look. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with dust, and the wooden floors creaked underfoot. But as he moved deeper into the structure, something caught his eye. A figure slumped against the far wall. It was a body: Megan Harris. Gerald rushed out of the cabin and immediately contacted the authorities. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Megan's lifeless body exactly where Gerald had described. She was sitting with her back pressed against the wall, her knees drawn up, and her hands resting loosely in her lap. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like she had simply fallen asleep, but the reality was far more sinister. There were no signs of trauma, no blood, no obvious indication of foul play. Her clothes were still neat, and everything appeared undisturbed around her. The initial autopsy provided the first clue. Megan had died from poisoning. The cause of death was a rare and highly potent toxin, one that could only be obtained from a select few sources. The police were baffled. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of any violent confrontation. Whoever had done this had taken careful steps to ensure that Megan's death would not leave any immediate evidence behind. As the investigation progressed, another shocking discovery emerged. Megan's phone, which had been missing since her disappearance, was found next to her body. It was cracked as if it had been dropped, but the device had not been tampered with. The fact that Megan had held onto the phone until her death raised more questions than answers. Why hadn't she attempted to call for help? Had she known her fate was sealed, or was she simply too incapacitated to react? The police began to re-examine Megan's life with a new perspective. She had always been the picture of normalcy. No enemies, no signs of any trouble in her personal life. Her family and friends were devastated by the news of her death, but they too were puzzled. There had been no warning signs, no indication that anyone would want to harm her. Then something even more chilling came to light: Megan's relationship with a former acquaintance. Through a deeper investigation into her phone records and social media accounts, the police discovered that Megan had recently reconnected with someone from her past, a man she had known in her younger years but had lost touch with. This man, whose name would later surface as Marcus Hartwell, became a central figure in the investigation. At first, the police had no reason to suspect Marcus. He had been out of town for years, and his relationship with Megan seemed innocent, just an old friend reaching out. But the more they dug, the more unsettling the connection became. Marcus had recently returned to Ravenswood, and it was clear that he had been in communication with Megan in the days leading up to her disappearance. What was more disturbing, though, was the realization that he had a history that wasn't as clean as it first appeared. The search for Marcus became the focal point of the investigation. As the police learned more about his background, they began to suspect that the quiet town of Ravenswood might be hiding far darker secrets than anyone had ever imagined. The investigation into Marcus Hartwell, the man who had recently reconnected with Megan, quickly gained momentum. Police began tracking his movements and delving into his past, uncovering a troubling history that had previously gone unnoticed. Marcus had grown up in Ravenswood, but had left the town years ago under murky circumstances. His return to town seemed coincidental at first, but as the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, it became clear that his timing was anything but accidental. The more the police uncovered, the more unsettling it became. Marcus had a criminal record, though nothing violent. He had been involved in a few petty thefts and had spent a brief time in prison for drug possession, but there was one incident that stood out. Years ago, he had been suspected of stalking a woman in a neighboring town, a case that had never gone to trial, but had left a trail of whispered rumors. Despite his charming demeanor, there was something about Marcus that unsettled those who knew him. His brief return to Ravenswood had raised eyebrows, but no one had expected his name to be associated with something as horrific as Megan's death. Marcus had been in touch with Megan frequently in the days leading up to her disappearance. They had exchanged texts and phone calls, all seemingly innocent, at least on the surface. The police discovered that the two had met up several times in the week before Megan vanished. These meetings had been arranged under the guise of rekindling an old friendship. But the question remained: why would Megan, a woman who had no reason to be fearful, agree to meet a man from her past who she had not seen in years? After further investigation, the police learned that Marcus had been facing financial difficulties. He had recently lost his job and was struggling to make ends meet. Could financial desperation have driven him to take a more sinister route? The possibility seemed likely, but still, there was no direct evidence linking him to Megan's death. He had an alibi. He claimed to have been at home the night she disappeared. But, as is often the case in investigations like these, the absence of evidence is not the same as proof of innocence. Despite the lack of concrete proof, the police began to suspect that Marcus had played a significant role in Megan's death. There were signs that he had been the last person to see her alive, and the poison that had killed her was something that only someone with access to specific resources could obtain. Marcus had a history of dealing with shady characters, and the authorities wondered if he had acquired the poison through some illicit connection. The more the police investigated, the clearer it became that Marcus was not being entirely truthful. His story was inconsistent, and his behavior had become increasingly erratic. Those who knew him noticed that he was acting unusually paranoid, often looking over his shoulder, avoiding eye contact, and disappearing for hours at a time. He had also been seen in the area near where Megan's body had been found, though he denied any knowledge of the place. But it wasn't until a breakthrough came from the most unexpected of sources that the police were able to piece together the final link. A local informant, someone with ties to the criminal underground, reached out to the authorities with crucial information. It turned out that Marcus had been involved in a much larger scheme than anyone had realized. He had been involved with a network that trafficked rare poisons, and it was through this underground network that he had acquired the toxin that had been used to kill Megan. The informant's testimony was enough to put Marcus in the spotlight as the prime suspect. The police arrested him and began questioning him relentlessly. At first, Marcus denied any involvement, insisting that he had nothing to do with Megan's death. But as the evidence against him mounted, his contacts with the poison dealers, his erratic behavior, and his growing desperation, it became impossible for him to maintain his innocence. The weight of the investigation finally broke through his defenses, and the truth came out. Marcus had poisoned Megan, not out of some twisted revenge, but rather because of a mix of greed and desperation. He had learned about her plans to leave Ravenswood, and he feared that she would take something from him. What started as a reunion between old friends had turned into something far darker. He had drugged Megan, leading her to the abandoned cabin, where she was ultimately found dead. The case seemed solved, but as with any good mystery, there was more lurking beneath the surface. As Marcus was arrested and taken into custody, the people of Ravenswood were left to grapple with the shocking truth. Sometimes the most dangerous individuals are those who blend in the best. The arrest of Marcus Hartwell seemed to bring a sense of closure to the investigation, but as the case unfolded, a deeper and more shocking truth began to emerge, one that no one could have predicted. The authorities had been focused on Marcus for so long that they had overlooked an even darker twist, one that would change everything they thought they knew about Megan's life and her final moments. As the police continued to interrogate Marcus, they uncovered a startling revelation. The rare poison he had used to kill Megan was not intended for her. The more they dug into Marcus's actions in the days leading up to Megan's death, the more they realized he had been part of a larger, more sinister plot. He wasn't acting alone. In fact, Marcus had been involved in a secret relationship with Megan, a relationship that no one knew about. The connection between Marcus and Megan went back much further than anyone had imagined. As it turned out, Megan had been secretly seeing Marcus for several months, rekindling their old friendship, and eventually developing an affair. They had kept the relationship hidden from everyone, including Megan's close friends and family. No one had suspected a thing, and Megan had been careful to keep it private, even from her own mother. But as their relationship deepened, things started to take a darker turn. It became clear that Marcus had been manipulating Megan, playing on her emotions and her vulnerabilities. He had promised her a new life, a fresh start away from Ravenswood, where they could be together. He painted a picture of a future, free from the constraints of their small-town lives. Megan, feeling trapped and longing for a way out, had begun to seriously consider leaving everything behind and starting over with Marcus. However, what she hadn't known was that Marcus had been keeping secrets of his own. He had been in contact with a dangerous underground network, a group involved in the illegal trade of rare poisons. His connection to this network was what had allowed him to obtain the lethal toxin that ultimately ended Megan's life. The chilling truth was that Marcus had planned to use the poison to kill Megan in a way that looked like an accident, all in the hopes of gaining access to her financial assets. The plot had been simple but twisted. Marcus had learned that Megan had recently come into a large sum of money from a family inheritance. He knew that once she was gone, he would inherit everything. He would take her money and disappear, leaving behind the small-town life he had grown tired of. But things had gone horribly wrong. Megan had planned to leave him, to escape with the money and start a new life on her own terms. Realizing that his grip on her was slipping, Marcus had taken drastic action. In his desperation to control her, he had poisoned Megan, hoping to claim her fortune before she could leave. He had carefully timed the poisoning to make sure she would be incapacitated and easy to manipulate. But in his haste, Marcus had made a critical mistake. He underestimated Megan's resolve. She had known, in some way, that something was terribly wrong. She had been poisoned, but even in her weakened state, she had tried to escape. Running to the cabin in a final attempt to evade Marcus's control, she had died there, alone, but with the knowledge that she was trying to escape his grasp. When the authorities fully uncovered Marcus's motives, it became apparent that the entire town of Ravenswood had been deceived. Megan, the beloved teacher and pillar of the community, had been living a double life, one that no one had suspected. Her relationship with Marcus had been kept hidden, and even those closest to her had been completely unaware of the danger she was in. As Marcus was charged with murder, the town of Ravenswood struggled to come to terms with the horror that had unfolded right under their noses. No one could believe that someone they had known for so long could be capable of such a monstrous act. The investigation, which had started with the simple disappearance of a beloved woman, had now unraveled a tale of manipulation, greed, and betrayal that no one could have predicted. In the end, Marcus Hartwell was sentenced to life in prison, but for the people of Ravenswood, the true shock of the case wasn't just the murder. It was the realization that even in the safest of towns, darkness can hide in the most unsuspecting places. Megan's death, tragic and senseless, was a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us can carry secrets that, when revealed, shatter everything we thought we knew.